What if the person you just mocked, the one you thought was beneath you, was the one pulling the strings all along? In the next few minutes, everything you thought you knew about power, control, and respect will be turned upside down. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about a bartender and a customer. It's a story of how one decision can make you disappear from your own life forever. The bar was unusually quiet that evening. Most of the regulars had already called it a night, leaving behind just a few scattered customers nursing the last of their drinks. The dim, amber lights cast long shadows across the polished wood counters, and the hum of the soft jazz playing in the background only added to the calm, almost sleepy atmosphere. Kyle, the bartender, wiped the counter absent-mindedly, glancing at the clock every now and then, hoping for the shift to end so he could call it a day. Kyle had worked at the Velvet Lounge for over 10 years. He knew this place like the back of his hand. Most of the time it was full of well-off regulars, businessmen, celebrities, and people who could afford the steep prices for cocktails and whiskey. But tonight, things felt different. He hadn't seen many of the usual faces. In fact, the last couple of customers left just as he was finishing cleaning the glasses. As he leaned on the counter, he sighed, wishing the night would hurry up and end. The door swung open with the soft chime of the bell above it. Kyle barely looked up, expecting another customer who'd likely just stop in for a quick drink before heading home. Instead, the woman who stepped inside caught his attention. She was tall, with a confident gait that commanded attention. Her dark, wavy hair framed her face, and her sharp, observant eyes seemed to take in everything in the room in an instant. She wasn't the type of customer Kyle usually dealt with, at least, not in his experience. She was different. There was something about her that made him pause for a second longer than usual. She approached the bar slowly, her heels clicking lightly on the floor. Kyle still didn't move. He wasn't the kind of guy who went out of his way to greet people, especially on a slow night. As she reached the counter, she gave him a small, polite smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes, as if she was already aware of the atmosphere Kyle had created in the place. "What can I get you?" Kyle asked, not bothering to hide his disinterest. He was hoping she would be a quick one, someone who just wanted to sit for a minute and then leave. The woman took a moment to scan the shelves behind him before responding. "A gin and tonic, please," she said in a soft but confident voice. Her tone wasn't demanding, but it carried a subtle authority, something Kyle wasn't used to from the usual crowd. He poured the drink without much thought, mechanically filling the glass and handing it over to her with a smirk. "I see you're not from around here," he said, eyeing her up and down with a judgmental glance. "Not many women like you come in." She raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything immediately. Kyle, feeling a little braver after the first few words, decided to keep pushing. "It's not really the kind of place well, for people like you." He let the words hang in the air, a mixture of mockery and arrogance in his voice. The woman's smile didn't falter. She took a slow sip of her drink, her eyes meeting his for the first time. There was no anger, no reaction, just calm. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice still even. Kyle chuckled, leaning on the counter. He wasn't going to back down now. "Well, this bar isn't exactly where the everyday people hang out. You know, high-class kinds of folks. A bit too fancy for most, don't you think?" A slight tension filled the air. Kyle felt his confidence grow with every word. He leaned in a little closer. "But, hey, you seem to be holding your own. A woman like you might have just landed here by accident, huh? Not sure if the people here would feel too comfortable." The woman didn't answer right away, but her gaze softened. She studied Kyle for a long moment before speaking. "And you think people like me are out of place here?" Kyle shrugged, clearly proud of his own words. "Yeah, most people who walk through that door belong to a certain crowd. You don't strike me as one of them." She didn't laugh. She didn't seem offended either. Instead, she just smiled this time with a touch of something more knowing. "I guess you don't really know much about me." Kyle took another sip of his drink, feeling increasingly smug. He was used to seeing people like her walk in, always unsure, always feeling a bit small in the luxury of the place, and he liked that. He liked being in control of the situation, making others feel like they didn't belong. It was his little power trip. But something about this woman was starting to irk him. Maybe it was her composure, or the way she didn't react to his jabs. With a shrug, he gave her a lazy smile. "Maybe I don't, but we'll see how long you last around here." The woman didn't say anything else. She simply took another sip of her gin and tonic, staring back at him with an unreadable expression. Kyle, feeling like he had won the exchange, went back to cleaning the counter. He was confident, too confident, and that's when things began to shift slowly without Kyle even realizing it. The woman took a seat at the far end of the bar, her eyes scanning the empty space as though she was sizing up the atmosphere. Kyle hadn't said a word yet. He just continued wiping the same spot on the counter, his mind already half closed to her presence. She cleared her throat lightly, drawing his attention. "A whiskey, neat," she said, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't a demand, but there was an unmistakable authority in how she spoke. Kyle finally looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time. He didn't smile. He never did unless he had to. He took a step towards her, eyeing her outfit, which was sharp and expensive, the kind of thing you'd see on a woman who knew exactly how to carry herself. That only made him more curious. She didn't look like the typical after-work drinker. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a place like this. "Whiskey, huh?" he muttered under his breath. "Trying to make a statement, are we?" A slight smirk appeared on Kyle's face as he poured her drink. He could already feel the familiar satisfaction of setting someone up for a joke, the kind of jokes that always made him feel superior, especially when it was clear the person didn't quite fit in. He'd had enough of rich, snooty types walking into his bar and acting like they owned the place. Maybe this one was no different. He set the glass in front of her with a bit more force than necessary. "Not really your kind of drink, is it?" Kyle said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "More of a wine cooler or something fruity, right?" He leaned in a little closer, his grin widening. He was trying to gauge her reaction, to see if she'd flinch, if she'd react the way he expected. Most people would, right? He'd seen it 100 times. Customers who weren't used to being the subject of mockery would either laugh awkwardly or shoot back with a weak defense. It was always the same. But the woman Ava didn't flinch. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead, she took the whiskey from the counter with a deliberate motion, her fingers lightly brushing the glass as she brought it to her lips. She took a slow sip, eyes never leaving his. She seemed unfazed. Kyle waited, expecting some sort of comeback, some sign that she'd been ruffled. But when she set the glass down, her gaze remained steady, and for a split second, he thought he might have misjudged her. "You know," she said softly, finally breaking the silence, "mocking people who don't fit your idea of normal is a poor habit to develop. But, then again, I suppose it's easier when you're the one in control, right?" Kyle chuckled, his confidence swelling. "Oh, I'm just having a bit of fun. Don't take it personally," he replied with a dismissive wave, clearly not understanding the gravity of her words. He leaned back against the bar, crossing his arms. "So, what brings you to the Velvet Lounge tonight? Haven't seen you around here before." Ava paused, swirling the whiskey in her glass. She didn't seem eager to answer. In fact, she seemed perfectly content with the silence, letting Kyle dig a little deeper into his assumptions. Her calmness only seemed to annoy him more, making him want to push further. "Just passing through," she replied eventually, with a small, knowing smile. "But I've heard some interesting things about this place." Kyle's curiosity was piqued now. He couldn't help himself. "Oh? What kind of things?" She took another sip, her eyes never leaving his. "Things about people who think they run the place, who think they can mock anyone who walks through the door just because they feel like it." Kyle's smirk faltered for a moment. It was subtle, but there was something in the way she said it, something in the way her eyes locked onto his that made him feel uncomfortable. But he quickly dismissed it, shaking his head and laughing. "Yeah, well, if I had $1 for every person who got offended around here, I'd be drinking on the house every night," Kyle joked, but it felt forced now. Ava didn't react to his joke. Instead, she glanced around the room briefly, as though considering something. Then she turned back to him, her voice quiet but cutting through the space between them. "I'm sure you'd be surprised by how much you don't know about who walks through this door." Kyle's chuckle turned into a nervous laugh. He tried to brush it off, but that uneasy feeling was beginning to settle in. What was it about this woman? There was something about her calm demeanor that made him feel small. And, for a brief moment, he wondered, what was her story? But he wasn't about to let her get the better of him. Not now. He just smirked again, trying to regain control of the conversation, but deep down, something told him that tonight was going to be different. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't laugh, didn't look surprised, and didn't even seem bothered by his remark. Instead, she picked up the glass and took a slow sip of her whiskey, as if she had all the time in the world. Kyle watched her closely, trying to read her face, but it was like staring at a mask. She didn't show any sign of discomfort or amusement. It only made him more curious. "Nice," she said after a moment, her eyes still focused on the glass in her hand. "You did a good job with the pour." Kyle's smirk faltered for just a second. It wasn't the response he had been expecting. He had been hoping for a defensive remark, maybe a look of insult. Instead, she was calm, even composed, something that unsettled him, but he quickly recovered. His sense of superiority was built on provoking reactions, and he wasn't about to let this woman throw him off balance. He leaned against the bar casually, trying to keep up his usual bravado. "You know, most people come in here for a good time, not to pretend they're someone they're not." He tapped the counter lightly, looking her up and down. "I mean, look at you. This is a bar, not a board meeting." Ava didn't seem to be in a hurry to respond, and that made Kyle feel almost like he had the upper hand again. People were usually quick to defend themselves when they felt attacked, but she wasn't giving him that satisfaction. She was too controlled, too calm. "I'm just here for the drink," she said after a long pause, her tone even, almost indifferent. No hidden agenda. Kyle was starting to get irritated now. This woman, whoever she was, wasn't reacting the way he expected, and that just made her more intriguing in a way he didn't fully understand. There was something about her presence that felt different, almost out of place in a bar like this, but that only made him want to push further. Sure, sure, he said with a sarcastic nod. No hidden agenda. You just happen to walk into a bar at this hour, dressed like you're here to close a deal, right? He smirked, almost like he was talking to himself. Yeah, I get it. Ava finally looked up at him, her eyes locking with his. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something sharp. But it lasted only a moment before she took another sip of her drink, her expression unreadable again. Kyle stood there, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping into the back of his mind. There was something off about this whole situation, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He had mocked her, and she hadn't reacted as expected. She'd almost made it feel like he was the one being ridiculous, and that made him uncomfortable, but he didn't want to admit it. Instead, he just turned away to refill another glass for a different customer, hoping that when he turned back, she'd have either left or given him the kind of reaction he was used to. But when he looked back, she was still sitting there, quietly sipping her drink as if nothing had happened. Kyle felt a strange sense of unease settle over him. This woman was like no one he'd ever met. Kyle studied Ava for a moment, trying to figure her out. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something about her that wasn't right. She was too composed, too calm. She was the kind of person who could easily blend into the background, yet commanded a presence without saying much. But that only fueled his need to push further, to test her boundaries. He leaned in a bit closer, speaking in a lower voice now. You don't look like you belong here, you know? This isn't exactly a place for people who are used to the finer things. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, but it was gone before he could read it. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared back at him, as if she was letting his words wash over her without taking the bait. Where do you think I belong? She asked softly, her eyes still locked on his. Her voice was smooth, but there was a quiet strength in it that Kyle hadn't expected. Kyle's mind raced. He was trying to goad her into a response, to get her to crack. He'd seen it work countless times. People would usually either get defensive or uncomfortable, both of which were fun for him to exploit. But this woman, she was different. She wasn't biting. I don't know, Kyle said, shrugging dismissively. Somewhere more comfortable. Somewhere you don't have to deal with all the rougher types. He let the words hang in the air, trying to imply something about her belonging to a different social class. Ava didn't react, not in the way he wanted. Instead, she slowly placed her glass back on the counter, the ice clinking lightly as she set it down. She seemed unfazed, like the barbs he'd thrown her way didn't even touch her. And that, for some reason, started to irritate Kyle more than he realized. You know, she said after a pause, her voice still calm, but now with a trace of something deeper, something more mysterious. I've always found it interesting how people judge others without knowing them. You don't know anything about me. Kyle couldn't help but scoff, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Oh, I know enough. You walk in here like you own the place, acting all high and mighty. It's not hard to figure out, sweetheart. The words were meant to be cutting, to make her feel out of place. But, once again, she didn't react the way he thought she would. Instead, she smiled, just a little. And Kyle didn't know if he liked that smile. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't nervous. It was knowing. Maybe, she said slowly, her smile never faltering. But you'll find out soon enough. Kyle wasn't sure what she meant by that, but something in her voice made him pause. He wanted to laugh it off, to keep the upper hand, but a strange, unfamiliar feeling began to creep into his chest. He shook it off, thinking it was nothing. It was just some weird vibe he was picking up from her. It didn't mean anything, but he had the feeling, deep down, that he'd pushed too far. He quickly reached for the bottle of whiskey to break the tension, pouring himself a drink, trying to mask the unease that was starting to bubble beneath the surface. But before he could lift his glass, Ava spoke again, her words hitting harder than any of the jabs he'd thrown at her. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice low and steady. "I do own this place." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Kyle's hand went still, the glass halfway to his lips. Did he hear that right? Did she just say? Ava didn't wait for him to respond. She took another sip of her drink, her eyes never leaving his, a small glint of something in them. Something that said she knew exactly what was coming next. Kyle blinked, trying to process what she had just said. His mind raced as confusion and disbelief collided. What did she mean? Own this place? There was no way he would have known. But the more he thought about it, the more it started to feel possible. The unease that had been nagging at him deepened into something else, something darker. And for the first time since the woman had walked in, Kyle began to feel a flicker of fear. Ava finally broke the silence, but her voice was steady, unbothered. "You're quite the charmer," she said, her tone neither sarcastic nor mocking. It was just calm, as if she was observing the situation rather than participating in it. Kyle smirked, thinking that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to crack. "I do my best," he replied with a wink, trying to play it off as though he had some kind of control over the situation. "It's a gift." But something in the air shifted, and he wasn't sure if it was her calm demeanor or the way she was looking at him that suddenly made him feel uneasy. It was like she was letting him talk, letting him dig his own hole, but he wasn't sure if she was laughing on the inside or if she was simply playing a different game entirely. Ava didn't look away. She leaned forward just slightly, her eyes never leaving his. The bar seemed to grow quieter, as though her presence was filling the room in a way that made the space feel smaller, more intimate. "You know," she said softly, "I've met people like you before. You think you know who's who based on appearances, but sometimes it's not what you see that matters." Kyle frowned, his ego briefly rattled by the comment. He wasn't sure what she meant, but it felt like a warning of some kind. The bar was suddenly too quiet, his usual confidence slipping as he tried to maintain the upper hand. "Oh, is that so?" he replied, trying to mask his discomfort with a forced chuckle. "And what exactly does that mean, huh? People like me?" Ava's gaze hardened just slightly, and for the first time, Kyle felt the weight of her eyes on him. It was almost as though she was studying him, sizing him up, and suddenly, it was as if he were the one being judged. The bartender's confidence faltered, but he quickly tried to mask it with a smirk. "Don't worry," Ava continued, her voice still calm. "I'm not here to lecture you, Kyle." The mention of his name caught him off guard. He hadn't told her his name, but somehow she knew it. Kyle's stomach twisted. How did she know his name? He hadn't mentioned it when he'd greeted her earlier, nor did she seem like the type to ask for names. There was something unsettling about her knowledge, something that didn't add up. But before he could ask, she dropped her next line, her voice now barely above a whisper. "Actually, I do own this bar." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any drink he'd ever served. For a split second, time seemed to stop. Kyle's mind raced as he tried to process what she had just said, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Did she just say she owned the place? He was stunned. He couldn't figure out if she was joking or if she had some twisted sense of humor. But no, she wasn't smiling, wasn't laughing. There was no sign that she was trying to play some kind of trick on him. I think you might want to watch your tone, Kyle, she added coolly, leaning back in her seat, her eyes never leaving his. I don't take kindly to people who judge others based on appearances, or who think they can make fun of those they consider beneath them. The air around them had thickened, the silence hanging heavier now. Kyle swallowed hard, trying to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow, even to him. Was this some kind of prank? There was no way she could be serious. How could someone like her own a bar like this? He chuckled nervously, reaching for a glass, trying to regain some sense of control over the situation. Nice try, he said, his voice shaky, but you're a little late for April Fools, don't you think? Ava didn't smile. She simply sat there, watching him, as the weight of her words settled over him like a cold, unsettling wave. Ava's silence stretched longer this time, and Kyle began to feel the weight of it more intensely. He tried to laugh it off, but it came out sounding forced, like the smile that barely reached his eyes. She wasn't giving him what he expected. No defensiveness, no anger, no retaliation, just quiet, patient observation. Finally, Ava spoke again, her voice low but clear. People like you, she repeated, her tone softening just a touch. You think that just because you're in charge of a bar, you're in control of everything around you. Kyle wasn't used to being spoken to this way. He had dealt with plenty of rude customers in his time, but none had ever made him feel so small. He was supposed to be the one in charge, the one calling the shots, the one who could make people squirm with just a few words. Yet here he was, suddenly unsure of what was happening. You see, the thing is, Ava continued, leaning in a little closer, most people in positions of power don't realize how fragile that power really is. They think it's a permanent fixture, something they own. But all it takes is one small change and it's gone. Kyle's heart rate ticked up slightly. Her words felt like a warning, but it was too subtle for him to fully understand yet. He looked at her, trying to read her face, but she remained impassive, her expression unreadable. It was almost as if she was delivering a lesson, but not in a way he was accustomed to. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was teaching him something. Sounds like you've been around people who know what they're doing, Kyle said, his voice more guarded now. He leaned back slightly, trying to regain some semblance of control. But his attempt to brush off her words only made him feel more exposed. This wasn't the usual back and forth he was used to. This woman wasn't rattled, and that made her more dangerous in his eyes. Ava paused for a moment, her eyes still fixed on his. She didn't say anything at first, and for a second, Kyle thought maybe she had said all she was going to say. But then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, she added, maybe it's time you learned a little about who's really in control here. Kyle's stomach tightened at her words. He didn't fully understand what she meant, but it felt like a veil was slowly lifting, revealing something he wasn't ready to see. For the first time that evening, he realized he might have underestimated her, and that realization was enough to make him uneasy. He quickly looked away, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up his spine. All right, he muttered, more to himself than to her. I think you've had enough fun for one night. But Ava just sat there, still calm, still watching him. There was something in her gaze now, something that Kyle couldn't quite place, but it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, unseen, but very much felt. Ava didn't smile. She didn't nod or give him any reassurance that he had said something clever. She simply took another sip of her whiskey, savoring it slowly, as though savoring the moment. Her gaze remained steady, never breaking contact with Kyle, making him feel like he was the one under inspection. Kyle shifted uncomfortably. He was used to being the one in control of conversations, but here, with this woman, it felt different. Her calm was almost unsettling. It made him second-guess his own words, his own actions. He tried to regain his usual bravado, leaning in a bit closer to the counter. "All right," he said with a forced laugh, trying to deflect. "You know a lot about power for someone just sitting at a bar. I'll give you that." He paused, scanning her face for any sign of weakness. But power doesn't just come from being quiet and mysterious. It comes from knowing how to use it, from being the one who calls the shots. Ava didn't reply immediately. She merely held his gaze, as if weighing his words against something he couldn't quite understand. Then she set the glass down with a soft clink, her fingers lingering on the edge of the glass for just a moment too long. "Power isn't about calling the shots, Kyle," she said, her voice calm, but now there was a hint of something else, something deeper, as if she was letting him in on a secret. "It's about knowing when to be silent, when to observe, when to let others believe they have the upper hand." Her words were becoming a puzzle. They didn't seem to make sense at first, but Kyle felt an unsettling sense that she was speaking from experience, that she knew something he didn't, that she understood the true nature of control, and it wasn't the kind of power he was used to seeing behind the bar. For the first time, Kyle felt a twinge of doubt. Who was this woman? What was she really trying to say? But before he could process his thoughts fully, the door to the bar creaked open again, and another figure stepped inside. It was a man, mid-40s, wearing a tailored suit, his face tight with worry. He moved quickly, looking around, his eyes scanning the room until they settled on Ava. "Ms. Johnson," the man said, his voice strained. "We need to talk. It's urgent." Kyle blinked, momentarily taken aback. Ava's name was Ms. Johnson? The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. His mind raced. Johnson. He'd heard that name before. It was familiar, but he couldn't place it. Ava didn't flinch at the mention of her name. She didn't look surprised at all. In fact, she just looked calm. Her expression didn't change. She simply nodded once, slowly, as if the man's arrival was expected. "You can wait," she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "I'm finishing my drink." Kyle's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't realized the man was waiting for her approval, for her permission. There was no sense of urgency in her voice, no rush. She was still in control. The man nodded stiffly, stepping aside to let her finish. Kyle's mind was racing. Something wasn't right. This woman wasn't just a quiet, well-dressed customer. She wasn't just someone trying to fit in at the bar. The pieces started to fall into place too slowly for him to fully grasp. Avenue Ms. Johnson. The way the man spoke to her. And then it hit him. His eyes widened as the terrifying thought crept into his mind. This woman wasn't just here to drink. She wasn't just another customer. She was someone important. Someone who could change everything. And Kyle had no idea who he was really dealing with. Kyle's mind raced, trying to catch up with her words. What was she getting at? Was she just toying with him, or was there something deeper behind her calm, cryptic responses. The way she spoke now, so measured, so assured, made him feel like he was losing ground. He had spent years honing his ability to manipulate situations, to use his words as a weapon. Yet, with her, it was as if every attempt to provoke or belittle bounced off her, leaving him more exposed. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could get the words out, the door of the bar swung open again. Kyle glanced over instinctively, his eyes drawn to the new figure who stepped inside. It was a man in a dark suit, carrying himself with the kind of quiet confidence Kyle had only ever seen in people with real power. He walked straight up to the bar, his gaze flicking over Kyle before landing on Ava. Kyle didn't recognize him, but the man seemed familiar with her. He gave her a small, respectful nod before speaking in a low, steady voice. "Ms. Williams, everything's in order. The staff is ready for the meeting tomorrow." Kyle froze, the words hitting him like a slap. "Ms. Williams." His stomach lurched. He glanced between the man and Ava, suddenly realizing something he hadn't even considered. The woman sitting in front of him wasn't just a random customer. Ava didn't react to the man's words, only offering a small nod in return. "Good. I'll be there on time. Thank you, Frank." The man gave another nod, then turned and left as quickly as he had entered. The moment he was gone, the weight of silence returned to the bar. Kyle stood there, staring at Ava as the truth began to dawn on him. Her name wasn't just Ava. She was Ms. Williams, and from the way the man addressed her, it was clear she wasn't just any ordinary woman. She was someone with influence, someone who didn't just visit places like this. She owned them. Kyle felt a cold chill sweep over him. All his earlier assumptions, all his mocking and condescending remarks came rushing back to him in a blur of embarrassment. The woman he had been toying with, belittling, was in charge. And now, with the weight of that realization crashing down on him, he could hardly move. Ava looked up at him then, her eyes calm, almost pitying. "You were saying something about power, Kyle?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a quiet finality. "About who calls the shots?" Kyle's mouth went dry. He had been so confident, so sure of himself. But now, standing in front of this woman, who was so much more than he had ever imagined, he felt small, insignificant. Every word he had said now seemed stupid, foolish, and completely misplaced. Ava's expression softened slightly, but there was no mercy in her eyes, only the faintest hint of disappointment. "You thought you had control because you stood behind a bar. But let me tell you something," she said, her voice cool but piercing. "True power isn't about being the loudest in the room. It's about knowing when to stay silent, when to let others speak for you, and when to make sure they don't know who you really are." Kyle stood frozen, his mind whirling. The sudden shift in power left him reeling, and his heart raced with the knowledge that he had underestimated her in the most spectacular way possible. But before he could respond, the moment was interrupted by a commotion outside. The door swung open again, but this time the atmosphere in the bar shifted. A loud crash came from the street, followed by voices shouting in panic. Kyle turned instinctively, his sense of reality still fractured by the revelation that the woman he had mocked was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The sounds from the street grew louder, and before he could take another step, a shadow crossed his mind, a thought that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Kyle's mind spun. "Miss Williams?" The name sounded so ordinary, so formal, but hearing it, hearing the way the man had said it, suddenly made everything feel wrong. She wasn't some regular customer, wasn't just another face in the crowd. Ava Mims Williams was someone of importance. She carried herself like someone used to power, used to being in control. And now, with that one exchange, Kyle's smug confidence began to crack. For a moment, he stood there, dumbfounded, trying to make sense of what was happening. The woman he had mocked, the one he had tried to put in her place, was someone whose presence commanded respect. Someone who had people working for her, managing things behind the scenes. He swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. The air in the bar felt heavier, oppressive. The reality of his situation was beginning to sink in, and the thought made his stomach twist. He tried to salvage the moment, trying to regain the upper hand, but his usual sharp tongue failed him. Instead, his voice came out quieter, more uncertain than he'd ever intended. "Wait, you're not just some regular customer, are you?" His words hung in the air, vulnerable, exposed. Ava's gaze softened, but there was no smile on her lips. She didn't need to say anything for him to understand. The look in her eyes was enough. She knew what he had been thinking all along. She knew that Kyle had been underestimating her, trying to play his little game of dominance. "I tried to tell you," she said, her voice still calm, but now tinged with something like pity. "But you were too busy judging me based on what you thought I was. People like you often make that mistake." Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. His mind raced through the last few minutes, replaying his actions, the words he'd thrown at her. He felt like a fool, an arrogant fool who had assumed that because he worked at the bar, he held all the cards. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, and he felt like the rug had been pulled out from under him. "You, dot, dot, dot." Kyle started, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The weight of his misjudgment was too much. How could he have been so blind? He thought he was in control, but the reality was much more complicated than he could have imagined. Ava Ems Williams wasn't just a woman who deserved respect. She was someone who had earned it. She was someone who could make or break people like him with a single word. Kyle stood there, feeling a tight knot in his chest. His mind raced, struggling to catch up with the reality that had just unfolded in front of him. He had thought he was in control, that he could keep her in her place with a few jabs, a bit of mockery. But now, with every word she spoke, every shift in her gaze, Kyle realized just how wrong he had been. He wasn't the one holding the power here, he was the one being played. Ava's eyes never left his, her expression unreadable as she leaned back slightly in her seat. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Kyle tried to muster a response, something that would allow him to regain his footing, but the words seemed to escape him. All he could do was stare at her, the weight of his own ignorance crashing down on him. "You," he started, his voice faltering. You own this place, don't you?" Ava didn't answer right away. Instead, she studied him for a moment, as though deciding whether to indulge him or let him stew in his own realization. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yes, Kyle," she said quietly. "I do own this place." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He took a step back, his mind scrambling to process everything. All at once, the little hints, the way she held herself, the respect the other man had shown her, the calmness she exuded despite his attempts to provoke came rushing back. He had missed every sign, every clue. He had been too busy trying to maintain control, to push his own superiority, to see what was right in front of him. But the shock of it didn't stop there. As the weight of her ownership settled in, Another thought struck him, even more horrifying than the first. If she owned the bar, then why, Kyle began, his voice barely a whisper, why did you let me treat you like that? He couldn't help but ask. It felt like the final blow, the truth that shattered everything. Why hadn't she stopped him? Why hadn't she called him out from the beginning? Ava leaned forward again, the smallest of smiles playing at the corner of her lips. It wasn't a triumphant smile. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of understanding, like someone who had been patient, letting things unfold on their own. Because, she said, her voice low and steady, sometimes the best way to expose someone's true character is to let them show it for themselves. Her words hung in the air, each one punctuating the realization that Kyle had dug his own grave. He wasn't just a bartender who had lost control of a conversation. He had just insulted, belittled, and mocked the owner of the very bar he worked in, and now he was reaping the consequences of his actions. But as Ava's words settled, the silence that followed was not one of triumph. It was one of understanding. Ava had seen everything, and she had let him expose himself. Kyle's heart raced as his mind tried to make sense of everything. He had been so sure, so confident, so certain that he was in charge. Yet now, in the space of just a few seconds, all that had crumbled. The woman he'd mocked, belittled, and tried to put in her place wasn't just another patron. She was the one who could shut him down with a single word. And he had no idea how deep the hole he'd dug for himself really was. The silence between them grew longer, and Kyle could feel the weight of it, heavy and suffocating. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. What could he even say? What could he do to fix this? He had insulted her. He had treated her like she didn't matter. And now he was standing there, completely exposed, realizing that she could make his life miserable if she wanted to. Ava's gaze never wavered, though there was a subtle change in her eyes, something colder, more detached. She seemed almost amused, as though watching him crumble was a quiet, inevitable consequence of his own actions. "You don't get it, do you?" Ava finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. It wasn't just about the drink or the jokes. It was about respect. You think you can mock people because you think you're in control. But you forgot one thing. There are always consequences. Kyle opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? How could he explain away the cruelty he'd shown? He had crossed a line, and he knew it. There was no undoing it now. Ava took a long, deliberate sip from her glass, watching him the entire time. The way she held herself, her quiet control, it all made sense now. She wasn't the type to react impulsively or lash out. She didn't need to. She had the power to make people like him regret their actions, and it was clear now that she had no intention of letting him off easy. But just as Kyle thought he might choke on his own guilt, Ava's next words hit him with a sudden, cold twist. "You think I'm just here to teach you a lesson, Kyle? Number, I'm here because you've made a mistake that goes beyond words." Kyle blinked, unsure of what she meant, but before he could ask, the door to the back room opened again. Frank, the man who had addressed her earlier, stepped in once more, his face now grim. He glanced at Ava, then at Kyle, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ms. Williams, there's been an issue. We need to discuss something urgently," Frank said, his tone now serious, bordering on urgent. Kyle's stomach dropped. He could tell by the way Frank spoke that whatever was going on, it wasn't good. Ava stood up slowly, and for the first time, Kyle saw her face fully shift from calm to something darker, more calculated. She wasn't just the owner of the bar. She was someone who handled problems that had consequences. Ava turned to Frank with a slight nod. "We'll talk later, Frank. Handle it. I'll be in my office." As she started to walk toward the back, Kyle couldn't help but ask, his voice low and shaky, "What's going on? What's happening?" She paused for just a moment, glancing back at him. There was no sympathy in her eyes, only a cold, hard certainty. "There's been an issue, Kyle. A serious one. You'll find out soon enough." Then, without another word, she disappeared behind the door, leaving Kyle standing at the bar, feeling more alone and exposed than ever. Something was about to happen. Something bigger than the mistake he had made with her. And he had no idea just how deep the hole was that he had dug for himself. But whatever it was clear now. The consequences of his actions had only just begun. Kyle stood frozen, each passing second making him feel smaller, weaker. He had tried so hard to control the situation, to play the role of the superior bartender. But now, standing in front of Ava, he was exposed. The reality of his situation began to sink in deeper. Ava's calmness didn't waver. It was as if she had expected this moment, this realization, to come. She wasn't angry or vengeful. No, she was something much more dangerous. Calm, collected, and infinitely patient. She knew exactly what she was doing. "You see," Ava continued, her voice low but deliberate, "I didn't come here to make a scene. I didn't come here to force you to acknowledge who I am. But you had to know the truth eventually. People like you, they're always so quick to dismiss others, to judge based on what they think they know." She let the words hang in the air, allowing them to settle on him like a weight. "But here's the thing, Kyle. You're not the first to make that mistake." Kyle's mind reeled. People like him? The words stung. He wasn't used to being called out in such a calculated, cold manner. For the first time, he felt the sharp sting of shame cutting through him. He had crossed a line, and now the consequences were becoming clearer. "What do you want from me?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He felt like a man on the edge of a cliff, teetering precariously with no way to climb back up. Ava paused for a moment, considering him. The air between them was thick with tension, but there was no malice in her eyes, only a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I don't want anything from you, Kyle," she said, her tone almost gentler now, "but I do believe in balance, in fairness." The last word hung in the air like a threat, and Kyle's heart skipped a beat. What did she mean by balance? What could she possibly want in return for her silence, for the kindness she was offering now, in the midst of his humiliation? His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Before he could gather his thoughts, Ava stood up, placing a few bills on the counter to cover her drink. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if she were letting him stew in his own regret. As she turned to leave, she stopped, looking back at him one final time. "I suggest you think carefully about your actions, Kyle," she said, her voice quiet but heavy with meaning. "Because there are people who don't forget these things, and sometimes the ones who you least expect can change everything in the blink of an eye." With that, she walked out of the bar, leaving Kyle standing there, his entire world spinning as the weight of her words crashed into him. He stood there for a long time, staring at the empty door, unable to move, his mind replaying every moment of their conversation. But as the minutes passed, something darker began to creep into his thoughts. She had made him feel small. She had shown him his place. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the back of his mind, something about the way she spoke about balance, about fairness, something that suggested she wasn't just talking about petty revenge. The unease that had settled in Kyle's chest suddenly felt more like a cold, sinking feeling. It was a feeling he couldn't shake, and it was beginning to dawn on him that Ava might have been hinting at something far more dangerous than just a verbal jab. Was she truly done with him, or was she simply biding her time? The chill that ran down his spine told him that the answer might not be as simple as he thought. And that's when the phone rang. Ava leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her glass. The casualness of her movement only made the situation more surreal for Kyle. He couldn't understand why she wasn't angry, why she wasn't demanding anything from him. His mind was still spinning, trying to make sense of her words, her calmness, and everything he had just learned. "I don't want anything from you," she repeated, her eyes never leaving his. But now there was a hint of something deeper in her gaze, something far more unsettling. "But what you fail to understand, Kyle, is that what's about to happen has already been set in motion." Kyle blinked, his heart skipping a beat. "What? What are you talking about?" His voice cracked as he spoke, the uncertainty seeping in. Ava smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile that seemed to hold all the secrets in the world, secrets Kyle was just beginning to unravel. She stood up slowly, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence of the bar. For a moment, Kyle felt like he was trapped in some kind of dream, like nothing was real, like the ground beneath him was slowly slipping away. "You're right about one thing," she said softly. "You've made a mistake, Kyle, and mistakes always have consequences." A chill ran down his spine, but before he could respond, Ava's phone buzzed. She pulled it from her purse, glancing at the screen. Her expression changed slightly, just enough for Kyle to catch it, something he couldn't place. It wasn't concern. It was something else, something darker. "Looks like the situation just escalated," she said, glancing up at him with a new intensity in her eyes. "You see, I wasn't just a regular patron here. I'm the owner of this place. But that's not all." She paused, letting the silence hang. "I also have a few connections that go beyond this bar." Kyle's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced, trying to catch up with her words, but it felt like everything was happening too fast. Ava's phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it. The look on her face shifted. She was no longer calm. Now there was a coldness to her, a certain finality. "Remember that guy, Frank?" she asked, her voice almost casual, as if she were discussing the weather. "He wasn't just a staff member. He's been keeping an eye on things around here. He reports to someone much higher up the ladder than you'd ever imagine." Kyle's pulse quickened. "What are you saying?" he asked, the words barely coming out. Ava's eyes narrowed and her lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm saying, Kyle, you're in a lot more trouble than you think. It's already too late to turn back now." She stepped closer to him, and for the first time, Kyle felt genuine fear. The whole room felt like it was closing in on him. She had known more than he could have ever imagined. And now, the consequences were real. Before he could speak again, she turned, heading for the door. Just before she exited, she paused and looked over her shoulder one last time. "One last thing, Kyle," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You thought you were in control, but you've just become a pawn in a much bigger game. You'll see soon enough." With that, she walked out, leaving him standing alone in the dim, empty bar. The silence that followed was deafening. Kyle was left with nothing but the weight of his own miscalculations. And as he stood there, unable to shake the feeling of impending doom, the phone in his pocket buzzed. The name on the screen made his stomach drop. Frank. Kyle answered the call, his voice trembling. Kyle. Frank's voice came through the line, cold and urgent. We need to talk. It's about Ava. You've crossed a line you don't want to be on the wrong side of. And just like that, Kyle realized he was no longer in control of anything. The game had already been decided. The twisted web Ava had spun was now closing in on him. Ava looked at her phone for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she glanced back up at Kyle, a small but knowing smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She didn't speak immediately, and the silence stretched on, leaving Kyle to wonder what was happening, what was going to happen next. He had no idea what she was playing at, but he had the uneasy feeling that he had just stepped into something much larger than a simple confrontation. She put the phone down with a soft click, her eyes locking with his. "It seems like you've been a little too careless, Kyle," she said, her tone still calm, but now there was an undercurrent of finality to it. "You see, things don't just go unnoticed in my world. Not anymore." Kyle's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Ava took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "You've been here for years, haven't you? And yet, you never bothered to notice that the people you think you have power over, the ones you mock, they're often the very ones who own the game. You think your words are harmless, your jokes innocent. But people who are truly in control don't need to show it. They don't need to prove it. They simply are." Her words hit him like a ton of bricks, but they were nothing compared to what came next. Ava's phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up quickly, her eyes scanning the message before looking back at him. "It's funny," she continued, "how the universe tends to work. You mock the wrong person, and suddenly things start to happen. People start to talk, and when people talk, things begin to unravel." Kyle felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice almost trembling now. Ava leaned in slightly, her eyes cold and calculating. "I'm saying, Kyle, that you're not the only one who's been making mistakes. You're not the only one who thought they could get away with things. But now, it's your turn to face the consequences." She stood up straight, her posture commanding, and Kyle watched, helpless, as she slipped a hand into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. She handed it to him, and he hesitated before taking it. His hand shook as he opened it, revealing a single photo. It was a picture of Kyle, taken from the shadows just outside the bar. He was in the middle of a conversation with a well-known criminal figure. Kyle's face drained of color as he stared at the image. Ava's smile widened, but it wasn't kind. "Remember that night, Kyle?" she asked, her voice chilling. "You see, power works both ways. I don't just own the bar, I own the connections, and right now, you're the one who's being watched." Kyle's breath caught in his throat as he realized the full extent of his mistake. He wasn't just dealing with someone who could ruin his career, he was dealing with someone who had the ability to destroy him entirely. Ava turned to walk away, but before she did, she added, "I suggest you start thinking very carefully about who you insult next time. The wrong person can change everything." And with that, she left, leaving Kyle standing there, his world crumbling around him, unable to shake the feeling that his life would never be the same again. Ava didn't respond right away. She just stared at him, as though the full weight of his ignorance was something to savor, something that could only be understood when the consequences finally caught up. Kyle's heart thudded in his chest, his mind racing with the possibility that something far darker was unfolding than he could have imagined. Finally, she put the phone down and leaned in slightly, her eyes locking with his. "What I'm saying, Kyle," she said slowly, "is that the joke is over. You crossed a line and now you're going to pay for it." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but his body was shaking. What had started as a simple confrontation, a few sharp words, a little mocking, was turning into something much bigger, something much more dangerous. Ava wasn't just a woman he had belittled. She was the owner of the bar, someone with power he hadn't even begun to understand. And now, it seemed, the stakes had changed. The phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it before looking back up at him. "That's the last message I needed," she said with a slight smile. "The deal's been finalized." Kyle's mind was spinning. "Deal?" he echoed, his voice hoarse. "What deal? What the hell is going on?" Ava's smile grew, but there was no warmth in it. "You really don't get it, do you? While you were busy thinking you were in charge here, I was busy making sure things were set in motion for the next stage. And you, well, you're a part of it now." The realization hit him like a cold wave. He wasn't just being humiliated. He wasn't just going to lose his job. Ava had been playing a long game and he had been too blind to see it. "What are you going to do to me?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the words thick with fear now. Ava stood up, her calm demeanor never breaking. "What's going to happen next?" she said, her voice soft but with an edge of finality. "Is that you're going to disappear. Not physically, not in the way you think, but you'll vanish from the people who think they know you, from the life you thought you had." Kyle took a step back, panic rising in his chest. "You can't." "I can," Ava interrupted, her voice cold as ice. "And I will. You mocked the wrong person, Kyle. People like me don't forget. And those who underestimate us, they don't get second chances." A chill ran down Kyle's spine. His vision blurred as the weight of his situation settled in. The people who once trusted him, who once saw him as a figure of authority, would soon forget his name. His reputation would be erased, his life overturned, and he would have no idea who had done it. Ava took one final look at him, her expression unreadable. "It's done," she said quietly, almost like a whisper. "Enjoy the silence." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Kyle standing behind the bar, the weight of his own foolishness crushing him. The power he thought he had, the control he thought was his to wield, had been taken away without a single act of violence. It wasn't about physical retribution. It was about something much deeper. As the door swung shut behind her, the last trace of confidence Kyle had evaporated. He was nothing now, just a shadow of his former self. And outside, in the quiet night, Ava disappeared into the dark, the quiet orchestrator of it all, having made sure that Kyle's world would never be the same again. The story reminds us that power isn't always what it seems. Often, we judge others based on appearances, thinking we know who holds the real control. But true power isn't loud or obvious. It's subtle, it's quiet, and it's earned through respect, not arrogance. Never underestimate someone, because the tables can turn when you least expect it. Treat others with kindness and respect, because you never know when you might need them or when they might become the ones in charge.